present your work.
Well, I'm Catherine. I guess by way of introduction, just saying a few more words as Chris has asked us to. I should say that I did my master's here in 2007, part-time till 2009. So it's really, it feels really special and a real privilege to come back and share some research learnings this evening. So thank you very much for having me. As Chris said, I started a charity called Refugee Support Network, which is a refugee youth education charity based here in London, and we have offices in Oxford and Birmingham as well. I started that just as a volunteer project. I was working at Save the Children in Education and Emergencies at the time, and I was working 4 days a week. I had just finished the masters, and so I suddenly had this kind of extra day to do something with, and I realized that there were quite a lot, or actually really significant numbers, of unaccompanied refugee and asylum-seeking children right on my doorstep in the area where I live in London. And so I thought, well, I've got a day a week. Can't do very much with that, but I definitely can do something. And I was really fortunate enough at the time to have a group of very competent and able and experienced friends around me who also wanted to do something. So we got together and we set up of what Refugee Support Network is today. So we now work across the UK with about 400 to 500 unaccompanied refugee and asylum-seeking and trafficked young people each year, doing a whole range of education interventions. So we run educational mentoring programs that work with a group of about 100 volunteers who give their time week in, week out to support these young people in their education. We have specialist advice and guidance programs, and we have a program that is focused on access to higher education. I'm not going to talk much about our practical programs with young people tonight. I'm going to talk about some research findings. So alongside those practical programs with young people, we also have a research stream where we work in close collaboration with another organisation that I'm also part of called Jigsaw Consult, which is a kind of a learning research and strategy consultancy looking at migration, education, technology and faith. And we work with them when issues around education and refugees come up. So we've recently worked on a variety of research projects, of contracts, mostly for UN agencies like UNICEF or UNHCR, or for other kind of larger NGOs like Save the Children, War Child Plan, or the kind of names that you guys would be familiar with. And it is honestly, one of the things that I most enjoy is getting to mix that kind of one day going in and sitting in a room talking with a recently arrived 15-year-old from Syria or South Sudan about their educational hopes and being able to practically enable them to start to realize their potential. And then the next day doing something that is all about the data and all about writing, and seeing those young people's voices transmitted into that world is one of the things that I most love. And being able to blend what's happening on our doorstep in the UK with what is happening in other places where there are often less resources around the world. So that's just a little bit about RSN. If anyone has any questions about Refugee Support Network more broadly, then do ask me at the end, because I'm not going to talk more about what we actually do this evening. As part of our research programme, a couple of years ago, we were contacted by a large donor. And this was kind of out of the blue. And I couldn't have made it up if I tried. A donor came to us, the two organisations, RSN and Jigsaw, and said, so over the past few years, we've invested about 5 million into this issue of access to higher education for refugee and asylum-seeking young people in low-resource environments. And we want to invest a lot more over the next 10 years, but we really want to know what works. So could you guys put together a team of about 8 to 10 people, and you can take a whole year, up to 18 months, to really get into the meat of this and try and work out what's going on, what's working well, and what are the lessons for the sector. And I'm sure many of you will know that is so unusual that someone will come to you with such a long time frame for you to do something and such freedom to really kind of dig into it. So it's been one of my favourite research projects that I've ever worked on, and I hope one day a donor will say something similar to us on similar issues. But it thus far has been a one-off to have that much time and that much freedom to investigate an issue. So we were looking at access to higher education for refugees, specifically in low-resource environments. And the kind of overarching topic for tonight is technology. But I did say to Chandra when he was organising this that this is not going to be a kind of pure and very technical presentation. Technology is a part of this issue and it's a core part of it. But you can't look at this issue without looking at multiple other things. So what I'm going to talk about today is the value of higher education for refugees in low-resource contexts, then a little summary of our research study, what we looked at and why, and then I'm going to spend most of the time looking at the key lessons that emerged for the sector and those involved in designing and facilitating higher education programmes for refugees in low-resource contexts. So let's see if I can use the clicker effectively, yes. Right, so firstly, looking at the value of higher education for refugees in low-resource environments, why higher education? I think you're all probably more than aware that the focus over the last kind of decade or so, even more, has been very much on enabling primary education for children in displacement and in emergencies. And then, over the last few years, we've seen secondary education get a little bit more impetus. And higher education is, coming along a not too distant third, but very much a third. But actually, it really, really matters. And we saw, interestingly, that when higher education is provided, and when there is even just the perception of access to higher education in displaced communities, access and motivation and participation at the lower levels of education increases, because people think, well, there's a point to this. I can continue. If I do this, I can progress further. I can carry on. So many of the refugee young people that we spoke to over the course of the 18 months that we did this study identified getting to university as one of their core life goals. So, of course, it contributes to rebuilding the lives of individual refugees. You guys are mostly students right now. You know that when you go to university, whether it's an undergrad or a postgrad or doing your PhD, being a student is actually quite a strong identity. We at RSN have had a young person who has been trying to get to university for the last 7 years. And in September this year, he finally got there. And the delays that he faced were nothing to do with his academic ability, but all to do with his asylum status. And I will never forget the day that he came into our office holding his student card and saying, like, look, I've got it, I'm starting next week. And it was one of the proudest moments of his life thus far, because he'd achieved so much to get to that point. And so we know that identity formation is a really important thing, particularly when you are in a time of kind of dislocation or transiency. We also know that it's a tool of reconstruction in countries of origin, of course. As in any country, investment in higher education is a massive part of creating the social and human capital to rebuild. But although, and I should say, actually that stat is fine. I was going to say some of the stats that I might mention tonight are like kind of 1 year out of date, because it was about 1.5 years ago that we were doing this research. Last year, just under 70% of refugee children managed to complete primary education across the UNHCR priority countries. So progress, just under 40% completing secondary, but they estimate that only 1% of refugees globally are accessing higher education. This is a problematic statistic, but it is the only kind of currently available estimate. There's no actual real rigorous research looking at demand for higher education and really quantifying that amongst refugee communities. And part of that is to do with, in many locations, the challenges or resistance that some communities have to registering with UNHCR. And so the data that we have is, it's not perfect, but it does tell us that there is a hugely greater number of university-ready refugees across the world than are actually accessing university. And actually, the last few years have been a particularly interesting time in this type of world, in that more students from countries of origin where they've had high participation rates in university, and particularly Syria and Iraq to an extent as well, are finding themselves displaced. And this is like creating a slightly different profile of potential student to what we've seen over the 10 years before that. So Syria had a pre-war university participation rate of about 26%, and yet we're seeing only 6% access university in displacement. So there's a real discrepancy there. And it's reasonable to suggest that even the most conservative estimates that have been done of university-ready students indicate that it really is a very small percentage of the population being served. The need can't be met by the many international scholarship programs that there are alone. And we decided to look at the role of blended learning programs in particular across the world. So forgive me if I'm explaining a concept that you're overly familiar with already, but just in case it's new to anybody. When I say blended learning, I'm talking about courses that have got a mixture of online components, but also have an element of face-to-face facilitation in country, and a community of learners that grow up around that. So, what did we look at and why? We aimed to map all of the programmes working on the issue of higher education for refugees in low-resource environments at the time of the study. Not just blended learning programmes. When we got to the fieldwork stage, that's what we were focusing on, but the mapping exercise that we did encompassed everything. We aimed to compare the existing models and then to learn lessons about effective provision that could be useful for the sector moving forward. As a result of the research, we have a landscape review, so I just put the pictures up there, so if you wish to read about this in more detail later, you can find them on the RSN website or on the Jigsaw website. The landscape review is covering everything of who's doing what where. It is now a year and a half out of date, and I should say that although it was a very comprehensive piece of research, it's also a rapidly changing field. So just a couple of weeks ago, I met a man who, since reading this research, has advocated with his university in America to set up a whole global program of blended learning for refugees in various contexts. So that wasn't even being thought about at the time that we wrote this. So it's rapidly changing, and new players are arriving all of the time. We also did a research study that built on the mapping exercise, but focused particularly on blended learning programs. And in that, we carried out 8 field visits. We looked at 15 different programs that were being offered. So that's 15 different types of programs by different providers. And it conducted a whole range of focus groups, in-depth interviews, and outcome stars exercises with young refugees. We supplemented that with distance-based interviews with a number of experts around the world who've been working in higher education for a number of years. We did fieldwork in a fairly wide variety of countries, looking at a broad range of programs, and worked in the field with all of these wonderful organisations, and I put that slide there just to really demonstrate that there are a lot of people who are engaging in this field, and one of the issues that I'll talk about later is coordination and lesson learning from the good practice that is going on, but is not always shared or talked about. So we had a number of analytical lenses that we reviewed the data through, and I will skip through these fairly quickly so that we've got enough time to really draw out the lessons. But we looked at accessibility and participation. So are students hearing about these courses? Are they able to get on these courses? And are they able to stay on the courses once they arrive? We looked at academia and organisational structure. So what are these courses offering? What pedagogy? How are they accrediting it? We looked at technology. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Blended learning, the challenges that come in with that. Dropout rates, how they can be reduced. And we looked at pedagogy, and I started to talk about that, you may have just noticed, in academia and organisational structure, and then remembered that we had it as a completely different category, because actually the pedagogy that university adopts in this was often a completely different pedagogy for teaching very similar subjects and materials, but actually had an enormous impact on the outcomes for students involved. And then we looked at the impact of that and the future of this sector. And when I talk about impact, we're talking about impact for the students who do these courses. What does it mean in terms of employability? What does it mean in terms of personal development? What does it mean in terms of contribution to communities? So in terms of accessibility and participation, actually what we found was a huge variety of approaches. Some people were going for the kind of scattergun approach and get the word out there to as many students as possible, but then having real problems in terms of having to turn away large numbers of students who might have invested a lot in an application process when there was actually only very few places available. We saw other programs where certain communities were targeted, and so actually there was a kind of inequality of access in terms of who was getting opportunity to do these research programs and to do these education programs and who wasn't, because particular churches, particular mosques, particular areas of a camp were being targeted for information about access. We saw that flexibility in terms of the model of participation was the key thing that enabled students to stay online. As you probably all find, even in this context, when you're studying, it's not your whole life. You're juggling multiple other commitments, multiple other responsibilities. That was times by 20 in the displacement context. So people having responsibilities for siblings, people trying to find work, people having to engage with UNHCR appointments, people applying for resettlement. And so having high degrees of flexibility was really critical in terms of whether people could stay on the programme. In terms of technology, I don't want to labour this point too much. We know that technology can facilitate enormous transformation. It's because of technology that the vast majority of these programmes even exist. The potential is huge. And yet, in every single location that we visited, still the same issues are emerging. Still there's lack of connectivity. Still there is lack of access to hardware. Still the spaces where people can come to learn are limited compared to the number of people who want to access them with the relevant connectivity and equipment that is there. It varied even day to day in the locations where we were studying. I mean, this isn't going to be a surprise to anyone, so I'm not saying this to make you think, oh gosh, sometimes connectivity is challenging in these environments, but to say actually, still, despite the high level of knowledge that we have about this, still this is the reality. And thus far, in the majority of programmes that we looked at, there was no magic bullet solution. All of the programmes were still struggling with this. In terms of pedagogy, This was something that was super important to the universities that we talked to. Super important for the universities in terms of them wanting to communicate their ethos, their model of learning to the students that they were talking to, but actually often not really seen or understood by the students. And that was primarily because the universities had assumed our values and what we want students to ultimately take on is going to be transmitted almost by osmosis as we teach. But there was very little kind of explicit explanation of this is why we're teaching in this way, and this is what we hope it's going to lead to. And so a lot of students, when you would talk to them about the types of pedagogy used, would say, well, that actually doesn't translate in reality. That might be what they say they aim for, but the reality of what's happening here is different. There was also a disconnect. Between students in the field and staff who were delivering the distance elements of the courses. So as I'm sure you realise, in blended learning, you often have a mixture of remote staff based in universities, often in contexts, delivering online lectures, marking students' work, providing them with feedback, and local facilitators who are helping the students through that process and providing additional input and learning. In almost every location, students felt that the facilitators and the lecturers in the distance locations had limited understanding context, were able to apply limited flexibility that was needed for the issues and the obstacles that they were facing in context, and were often teaching in a slightly in a way that demonstrated ignorance in some cases of the context that the students were in. That said, there were enormous positives that came out. One of the very unique things about a couple of the models is that they were able to connect students in classrooms in one country with students in classrooms in another country. And we're not talking about connecting students in Jordan with students in the US, but connecting students in Jordan with students on the Thai-Burma border, with students in Malawi, with students in Dadaab, and getting a learning community going between those students. And in terms of global awareness and sense of citizenship and a kind of peer level challenge of worldview and experience and expectations. That was one of the most unique things about some of the pedagogical approaches that were adopted. It forced people to think outside of their own context in a way that was much more complex and multifaceted than it would have been had it been just we're connecting a group of students in a high resource context with a group of students in a low resource context. And again, as is not surprising, and as is the aim of much higher education, critical thinking skills and ability to participate in community leadership happened across the board, which was something that young people highly valued. In terms of impact and future, there was a perceived impact and then an actual impact, and often a disconnect between the two. So the perceived impact on the future for students who were about to start and students who were partway through their course was immensely high. The actual impact for students who had recently graduated or were about to graduate within the next few months was really an unknown because of the lack of monitoring and evaluation and tracking of students after they'd finished their course. Of course, it depends on employment prospects within the country, the host country. Is there the right to work? Are the students allowed to leave the camp if they're in a camp context? Does the country that they're studying in recognise online learning as something that can be accredited? There are a lot of contextual issues on site before you even start to address the question of ultimate country of destination. So a lot of the students that we met were in the process of applying for resettlement, and there were questions about transferability of credits, whether the course that they'd studied was going to be able to mean something to them, even in the cases when they were being resettled to the same country that the university who was accrediting their course was from, which might sound strange, but we had several cases of students having part completed a higher education program from a US or a Canadian organisation, then being resettled to that country and being unable to use the learning that they had to continue their education at the relevant level and still having to go back to the start. So that was problematic. However, when we looked at personal development and critical thinking, the changes were a lot easier to measure. So what I want to finish with is 8 emerging lessons for the field. And this is really where the meat of the study was and what we took away from it. Firstly, maximum positive impact requires complex trade-offs. We met a lot of people in the course of this who said that they had the solution and that it was quite easy. In all cases, that turned out not to be the case. And so we identified a set of choices that people would have to make. Is a course going to be internationally accredited or nationally certified? Have a deep impact for a few, and we saw the life-transforming impact of international scholarships, where very small numbers of students were given the opportunity to study in another country, or a broad impact for many. So the MOOCs model, where in theory, anyone, anywhere, to a kind of infinite number of people could access this. And yet organisations didn't want to invest there because there was only 10 of them rather than 30 or 40. So what to do with that, and different organisations have different approaches to that question. Should the courses be bespoke courses for refugees, or should they be integrated into the national system? And again, this links back to the question of what is the future for these students who are learning, and they have multiple possible futures. Doing courses that are blended into or integrated into the national system has enormous benefits for those who are going to stay in that country. What about those who are not going to stay? Should the programmes be culturally contextualised, or should they be universal programmes? I found this a really fascinating question. So essentially what this is looking at is, should the academic content of these courses be produced ground up from, so for example, we're working with Syrian students in Jordan, ground up from Syrian academics on site for them, and then delivered in a very sort of contextualised local context? Or should it be a programme that's come from, for example, the US? It's basically the US programme with a few tweaks delivered in another country. Almost every practitioner that we spoke to said it should absolutely be culturally contextualised. We can't have this kind of, American universities just kind of coming in with their programs and delivering their model as if that's better than what could have come through the local system. And that was a really strong narrative, which, to be honest, I also went in probably of that point of view. But almost all of the students that we talked to said, no, we really want to have the certificate from Georgetown or whatever the university was that was accrediting their programme. We don't know what country we're going to be in the future, and we think this is giving us more capital to work with as we move forward. So there was often this kind of discrepancy between what the students were saying they wanted and ironically what the practitioners were saying they thought they should want. Should the programmes have standard academic criteria or special criteria for refugee learners? So a lot of the universities that are accrediting these programmes are really grappling with this. Do we require students to meet the same standard as the other students who are not from a refugee background who are coming in? Because that's needed for our governing body to sign off on the accreditation? Or do we say, actually, there's been enormous fragmentation of education here, and we need to make allowances for that, and we need to have a slightly lower entry point and bring students on a journey with us? We found that this was particularly important when it comes to think of gender. So almost all of the courses had slightly higher male participation and female participation, and a lot of that was to do with a larger disruption in education, obviously generalising enormously, but for, on the whole, female students and them not being able to access the courses. Is the HE for the current context, or is it for the future context? Is it for the hope that X student will someday be able to return to Syria and they need a higher education that is going to be appropriate for that? Or is it for the fact that they are midway through an application process to be resettled to Canada? Everything is unknown, and designing a higher education program when you don't know the futures of the students and they don't know their futures is kind of held up as a very challenging issue. Although, to be honest, to a lesser extent, no student knows their future. I mean, you guys don't know where you're going to be working or living in future either, but this issue is particularly exacerbated. Now, of course, none of these are really either or. You can do elements of both. There's complexity there. It's not just a harsh choice that you have to make. But similarly, they're not false dichotomies either. These are real choices that people running these programs are having to engage with and make decisions on. And I think really for us, the main thing that we took away from it is every course that is designed, every program that is set up, every organisation that is engaging in this field needs to find their place, and they need to articulate their answer to each of these questions. Because what the field needs is variety. It needs all of these things, really. What is challenging is when people start without having engaged with these issues in advance. And as I mentioned earlier, when people say, we've got the answer and this is how it works. And if you take away anything from today, I would encourage you going forward in whatever jobs you're doing already or end up doing in the future, that if you meet anyone, as we did on several occasions in the course of this study, who says, yeah, well, our model is just the best. This is the future. This is the way that refugees in low resource environments are going to get access to higher education, and it's really very simple. Just don't believe it, because it's really not true. And it's actually the engagement with these complexities and deciding this is complex. We recognise that we're going to situate ourselves here for this reason because of our context that actually leads to better outcomes. Programs are inherently challenging and face multiple barriers, essentially what I have just been discussing. The context is so different, and this relates to this as well. Programs should be designed accordingly. We worked in one host country where at the time, no employers recognised online learning, and the national government didn't recognise online learning either. And yet there were multiple higher education programmes that were entirely online learning. And the mismatch between students' expectations in doing those courses and then the reality that they faced afterwards was enormous. And that's just one example. Fourthly, employment is not the only reason that students value higher education. And donors repeatedly said to us, well, how many are getting jobs? What sectors are they getting jobs in? Where are they getting jobs? It's really hard to answer that question at the moment because of this lack of ongoing monitoring and ongoing tracking of students after higher education. But the one thing that is really clear is, whilst the employment agenda is important, it is not the only reason, and not even the key reason why the students that we spoke to said they wanted to learn. The transformation in worldview, the transformation in resilience, and the transformation in critical thinking were all identified by students as critical. And I think there's one young man that I met whilst we were doing some fieldwork in Jordan that I honestly don't think I will ever forget, because I learned an immense amount from him in a very short space of time. And he was from Khartoum, and he was studying on this program in Jordan. And he had experienced intense racism in Jordan over the years that he'd been there. He told stories of repeatedly, day by day, on his way to study, having cups of coffee thrown in his face or cups of tea thrown on his face in the street and being shouted at. And he said, I used to feel like I would descend into a black hole that I couldn't climb out of, and that there was no future for my life. Now that I'm kind of a year and a half into studying, I still have days when I feel like that, but I've gained the tools, and I'm not even putting my kind of spin on his words. These are his actual words. I've gained the tools to pull myself out of that hole, and I stay there for less time than I used to. And his whole way of approaching life had changed because of the critical thinking skills that he had learned as part of this course. And that to me was something that, 6 months in employment may or may not have ever given him, and I hope he has been able to find employment as well. We talked about the high degree of dependence on technology, and it's unescapable. Every program that we visited had difficulties, and the real transformative impact was still not really taking place. We still had students travelling. In Thailand, we had some students travelling 2 hours to get to the learning centre, only to find that day there was no connectivity, or that someone had stolen the laptop that they'd been given. Classic issues that I think everyone's aware of, but it's not a silver bullet. We heard a lot about cost per beneficiary models, particularly from donors, saying, well, what's the most cost effective? Which model can reach the most people for the smallest amount of money? This is to be treated with real caution. What we found, and again, this is no surprise, that cost per beneficiary is so complicated. A lot of the organisations that we looked at didn't even know their cost per beneficiary. But what we did find is that not definitively, but by and large, the very low cost models were not reaching the most marginalised young people. And all of the factors around proximity to learning centres, history of education, extent of vulnerability, all influence the cost per beneficiary, amongst many, many other factors. And it's a lens, I think, that is to be treated with caution. It's expanding fast. I mentioned, the sector's grown even since we did this study. In light of that, collaboration and evidence building and sharing of learning is really critical. I think there are consortiums that UNHCR has, a Connected Learning and Crisis Consortium, which is probably the major body for sharing of learning and of trying to move this sector in low resource environments forward. But there's more that remains to be done, particularly in terms of tracking impact, to be able to create an evidence base to allow this sector to really grow, and to grow in the ways that have most impact, rather than just a kind of proliferation of projects. And finally, in this sector as it grows, one of the types of organisation that is joining the scene is universities with no background in humanitarian work. And sadly, we saw a number of occasions where institutions from the very best of motivations and wanting to boost access actually were inadvertently putting students in a position where they were becoming more vulnerable and more at risk because of attempting to participate in their programme. So one example would be an international scholarship programme who would hold a large meeting to talk to students in a camp context. This happened to be in Jordan, about their programme in a European country. Encourage vast numbers to apply, explain the criteria for application, which included having transcripts or degree certificates from country of origin. And we then had family members tell us about prospective students who had chosen to take the very risky journey to travel back to Syria to retrieve degree certificates just to be able to apply. They didn't even have the guarantee of a place at this stage. This particular example has been addressed since this time, but the lack of familiarity with humanitarian principles and protection issues amongst some of the newer players coming onto the scene is something that was really, really critical. So I'm going to leave it there. The only thing that I will mention to wrap up is that in terms of following on from this and what's happening now, we're just about to start what I'm really excited about. I think it's an exciting new piece of research that we're in the first couple of months of a 3-year study, which is in partnership with UNHCR, that's looking at the impact of participation in secondary and higher education in a couple of countries. So focusing on Rwanda and Pakistan, but looking at lessons that can be learnt for the broader context. So if anyone is particularly interested in these specific issues, then do keep in touch, because we'll be gathering a lot of hopefully interesting data over the next 3 years, and we'll keep you posted on the outcomes.
Okay, thank you very much for that Very wonderful and inspiring input. Catherine, for me, is an example of a graduate that we dream to help along her way. A change maker, somebody who sees the world differently and takes it by the neck, by the scruff of the neck, and makes reality shift. And I'm sure you'll agree, the presentation you just heard, emerging from a problem locally into an opportunity because of a donor approaching the group of people who got involved, and then mushrooming and growing serendipitously into this wonderful program we've just heard about. I'm sure there may be some burning questions, and I have a few, but I won't hog the mic. Perhaps somebody from the floor might like to ask questions. We'll, about 10 minutes, we'll take 3 or 4 questions and then move to the second speaker. Yes? Could you say who you are?
Sure.
and then ask your question?
Okay. My name is Adam. I'm currently an MA student here at UCL studying EID. Previously I was working in Thailand. You mentioned Thailand. And you also mentioned about this kind of dichotomy between culturally contextualized or universal programs. Now, in Thailand, we had a slight issue that culturally contextualized programs sometimes meant critical thinking kind of took a back seat because it was people would actually say things to us like, in Thailand we don't do that. You know, that's not culturally contextualized. That's not our culture. And yet there were times when we felt that actually we did not want to impose. On the other hand, it was this was something that was actually quite dear to us and something we felt was important for the program. When you are confronted in that way with I guess trade-offs you don't want to make, what do you do? Have there been incidences when you've had to, you know, really throw the baby out with the bathwater?
That's a good question. I think what it makes me think of is, and I should say that I didn't do the actual fieldwork in Thailand. I was sadly not allocated that country to go to. But what it makes me think of is the best thing that we saw in terms of addressing that issue was what I touched on really briefly when they were able to connect learners in different countries. And some of the young people that we spoke to in Dadaab and in Jordan, and they were referencing learners in Thailand and in a couple of other countries. They said they started off from that point that you've just articulated and saying, well, I started off thinking that this was the only way to do things, that this was how we had to study, and this is how we think, and and my religion is the only thing that can be accepted or whatever. And then not my university course taught me how to think critically, but then I talked with this girl in Dadaab camp, and she had such a different opinion, and she really argued with me, and they've had that a really robust interaction from completely different cultures, styles of learning, and religions that actually seem to have led to more critical thinking than any sort of attempt to teach critical thinking probably could have. And so for me, that was the kind of the glimmer of hope. In terms of your question about have you ever had to throw the baby out with the bathwater, I'm trying to think of an example. I mean, I think there's been so many times, like for me personally, there's been so many times when I've been engaging in a program that you've just thought, nothing about this is ideal. And the temptation sometimes is to just think like, oh, I'm going to go and, well, my temptation is to think I'm just going to stop engaging in this program because I don't know how to make it work. I just don't know what to do. And the key thing for us in terms of addressing that and trying not to throw, or gradually slowly learn how not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, has been youth participation. And so I'm kind of thinking back to RSN now, so going like much more back to what we do practically with young refugees. The most important thing has been the role of our youth advisory board, the role of, we have a young leaders course as well, so the input of those young people in helping to make the trade-offs and kind of presenting the trade-offs really openly to them and saying, look, we've got limited resources, we've got limited time, this is what is available to us. It's not ideal for this reason, this reason, this reason, what do you think? And helping them to sort of decide together what the best way forward is. So we've done that recently with part of our Access to Higher Education programme in terms of some issues we were having around prioritising accessibility of what we were doing and depth of what we were doing. And they ended up, well, their input basically shaped the decision that we made as an organisation, and we decided to prioritise depth for now rather than extending to other young people. I don't know if that's the same decision that we would have come to if we just sat around as a sort of management team discussing that. So that's been, for me, helpful when making hard choices.
Okay. Other questions?
Yes.
Yes.
I have a similar interest about this culturally contextualized, and another one is universal programs. And my interest is how to define the universal, this kind of term. Does it defined by the organization from the aid country? For example, the America, they have some aid agency to invest the program. So I think they definitely adopt the US style, or the programs they adopted the method from different countries, or might be, I don't want to be offensive, but I think might be Western style or something like this. So yes, this is my question.
How they defined universal was basically to do with the extent of the recognition of the certification or accreditation. So when they kind of used the word universal, what they were getting at is not courses that have, I mean, I don't think any course could have material that is, nothing is universal in terms of content. But they were getting at courses whose accreditation would be recognised in more than one country. And of course, there's a massive debate around that, and that isn't as it should be. But it was essentially students saying, if I have a qualification from this set of countries, I think that will be recognised more broadly than if I have a qualification from this set of countries, which may or may not be the case, but that was the kind of narrative that they presented to us at the time, and that's not necessarily reason to just then continue offering that to reinforce that. Maybe the whole system needs changing, but then you have the question of changing the system and then the lives and outcomes for these immediate young people in the midst of that. So yeah.
Yes. We'll take those two and then we'll move to the next speaker.
So two kind of clarifications, I suppose, really. First of all, who is kind of developing and coordinating these programs, generally speaking? Are they NGOs and partnerships with universities, and how do they come about? And secondly, you talked about a low-cost model and how that wasn't particularly effective, but what would constitute a low-cost model?
Okay, yeah, it's really good questions. So kind of what are these programs and how do they come about? It is typically universities working in partnership with NGOs. So it's probably helpful if I just really briefly describe some of the key players. So the model that you, or two different models that you often have is either a fairly sort of reputable university partnering with an NGO who's got on-site physical presence in an affected community, so that they provide the materials, they provide the accreditation, and they provide online lectures and mark the work, and they have facilitators locally who do group discussions and do study skills and computer skills and a whole range of different things, and that can set up classroom context. So some examples, if you're interested in looking at like particular examples, firstly look at the, if Chris is able to share the PowerPoint, I don't know, but to look back at that logos page, because the names of a lot of the key organisations are there. But I would suggest looking at Jesuit World Learning. They're one of the largest kind of players in this. They work with a number of different universities across the US and have physical learning centres in camps in about, I think 10 to 12 different countries. Where there are significant refugee populations. Also, Kepler is a model that is often talked about. It's not so geographically expanded as Jesuit World Learning, but it's in Rwanda. It's an example. It's an example of where the on-site provision is very extensive and very well developed, but is accredited externally. So that's just a couple. I mean, one that's come up that you won't find on that set of logos is from Arizona State University. So I mentioned that I'd recently met this guy who's started this huge program. So Arizona State University have recently set up a similar kind of blended learning program in various countries around the world. But if you look up the UNHCR Connected Learning and Crisis Consortium, then you'll find all of these people plus organisations that are purely online providers running MOOCs that are part of that as well. And the low cost thing, typically the more online the model is and the less in person it is, the lower the cost. The less subsidy has to be given to a student, so the less travel expenses have to be paid, the less childcare costs have to be covered, the less additional academic input to get people ready to the point of being able to do the course, the lower the cost. Hence why you kind of, you lose some of the most vulnerable in that process.
Okay, let's take one more and then move to the next speaker, please.
Hi, my name is Hannah. I'm studying here, MA at EID, and I totally agree with your idea of like higher education needed is really critical for reconstruction. But sometimes I witnessed like rather than helping the reconstruction, they just stay and just sometimes it causes brain drain.
Yeah.
So what do you think about this? So do you have any solutions or something? I wanted to ask this fundamental question.
Yeah, no great solutions, I'm afraid. But yeah, I mean, this is one of the major critiques that's levied at international scholarship programs, that there is often this like idea of reconstruction, and a lot of students that choose to stay in the country or find a way to be able to stay. And in some ways, that's why this idea of blended learning has gained some momentum over the last few years, because the hope is that in providing a really kind of a robust academic qualification that might have the same appeal to a student as a qualification from a university that they might get an international scholarship to, but that is happening in place may kind of, but I mean I don't know if that's really real or not, but yeah, I've heard a lot of people say that.
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine. One comment I would ask you is, listening to the models, it made me think, do we have a typology which describes the models, their organising characteristics and their strengths and weaknesses and where they might evolve, and mapped out, that you've described collaborations between non-formal and state enterprises, universities, but there will be other models having advantages for particular target audiences and working contexts. Do you know of a piece of work that has a typology of types?
Yeah, that's the landscape review that we did. So that does have that. I've talked mostly about blended learning. That's what I kind of find most interesting personally. But the landscape review goes through 5 different modalities of types of programs. So, and it does a sort of a variation of a SWOT analysis of each modality, and it compares and contrasts them. So it looks at, if I can remember them all, online learning only, blended learning, scholarships within the country, so basically facilitating access to national university systems, international scholarships, and then finally, and this is a slightly different one, information sharing platforms, looking at how people find information out about opportunities to study. So yeah, if you're interested in that, then have a look at the landscape review.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you very much for that input, and let's move now to our second speaker, Dr. Lindsey Byrd.
Do you want the...
Yeah. Thank you. And the clicker's up there.
I think I've left it there, yeah.
Okay. Oops. Right, so this is me not being able to use technology very well. I might, although I'm an advocate of technology, I'm not a very good user of it, so you're going to have to forgive me at times that I will have to try and rejig things, and hopefully this PowerPoint will come up. That's it. Sorry, is it okay?
Yeah, I can just put this on the pocket.
Okay, so Chris asked us to introduce ourselves a little bit. For those who don't know me, I'm Lindsey Byrd. I also studied here at IOE to do my PhD in conflict and education. And my interest in technology and the use of technology in education and educational planning came about actually from my PhD research. It was quite interesting. I worked with refugees, Congolese, Rwandan and Burundi refugees in refugee camps in Tanzania for my research. And I found out that a lot of times the communication in terms of repatriation and how different modalities of communicating not only within the camp and between camps, but also back home in Burundi or Rwanda or Congo were through mobile phones. And later on through the use of internet, because it was back in the day, a long time ago before mobile phones were ubiquitous. And so a lot of refugees didn't have access to technology. There were sort of sometimes opportunities to go to internet cafes in the town, but it was a complicated process. So I was interested, as the use of mobile phones increased, how the transfer of knowledge and transfer of information happened between those refugees. So that was the start of my interest in technology. When I joined UNESCO and the International Institute for Educational Planning, I held a seminar, and I was very privileged on technology. I held this seminar on technology and the use of technology in emergencies, and I was very privileged to have Sugata Mitra. And how many of you have heard of Sugata Mitra? Okay, so a few of you. Sugata Mitra, look him up on TED Talks. You'll see later on his name. But he came and talked at this seminar, and he blew us all away. He was just, if you've ever heard of him and heard him speak, he's so entertaining. And he talked about not technology in emergencies, but technology and how children learn in very low resource environments in India, and how children were learning by themselves. So he also inspired me to sort of think, technology has the opportunity perhaps to leapfrog some of the cumbersome education systems that we impose on our children. And when I worked in South Sudan for many years, going backwards and forwards, and after the conflict, the Ministry of Education was trying to rebuild the systems and structures of their education environment. And I said, you can have anything you like. You don't have to stick with the traditional education system that we're used to. Why don't you try something new? Look at technology. They wanted to stay with the system that's the internationally recognized system, which you can understand. But I still wanted to pursue this idea of what's the purpose of technology, and how can we introduce it more in our planning and in our teaching and learning. So I've I haven't done any research on this, so this isn't a research presentation. It's my thoughts basically. As an old, somebody said an old fart one time, so I'm probably that nowadays. But so it's a presentation centred around three kind of areas that I think have particular importance in this field. So we've heard quite a lot as well from Catherine about teaching and learning, and I think this is the area that's most often covered when people talk about technology and the use of technology in education and technology in education in emergencies. This is the area where most people have done either research or have programs or are working in this field. Educational planning, that's coming up as a bigger field in terms of how you use technology to support system strengthening and educational planning in situations of crisis, and I'll talk more about that. And then lastly, centred around sort of improving implementation and how you can support people who are delivering programs and encouraging sort of greater effectiveness in their programming. Okay, that's it. Okay, so if we're looking at sort of obstacles that have to be overcome, one of the speakers at this seminar I was talking about in 2009, he was working in Palestine and he used mobile phones. Some of you may have heard of this program called, or an organization called Souktel in Palestine. And he was developing a system of mobile SMS alerts to warn students when there was an attack likely to happen, when it meant they had to stay away from school, when where they could access other learning resources. And then also there's a similar program that looks at e-learning for students, so that again mobile phones and sort of e-learning from different types of courses online are available for students who aren't able to go into class. So they're basically, I mean, you'll have it in your own systems here. You'll have online modules and you'll have online access to different courses. Those weren't available back in the day. They were new things. So these things were just being set up in Palestine, and in a situation where you're constantly under bombardment and being basically blocked from getting through to your school, these were opportunities to access some form of education. As I said, Sugata Mitra was, has anybody heard of the granny cloud? Yeah? Again, a fantastic sort of idea of using volunteer grannies, basically people who are sat at home, who had retired ex-teachers often, who had expertise in maths or English or whatever the science or particular topics, and they would mentor and support students over Skype to help improve children's learning. Sugata Mitra's philosophy is all about children are able to learn themselves. We're all intelligent human beings. We all have a capacity to learn for ourselves, and he often would say children sometimes can learn better by themselves if they've got a facilitator that's sort of standing on the edge and just guiding them, than being force-fed material that they're not necessarily always interested in. So that was another type of overcoming obstacles. Radio, bizarrely, is still probably the most used and most successful. We don't think of it nowadays as technology, really, do we? We always think that it's got to be sort of online or networked or on a phone or something. But radio actually, and even the wind-up radios, which still exist, are probably some of the most successful programs in terms of giving instructional information, not just on for education programs, but also for health and safety, and in emergency situations, they are crucial. So, for example, in the Ebola crisis in Uganda, radio, immediately alerts are put out on radio. Mobile phones are sort of, to an extent, taking over some of that role, but in terms, everybody listens to the morning radio. I don't know about you, but I do every morning. The radio is immediately on, and that's where I get a lot of my news. So we kind of still forget and underestimate a little bit of how important radio is to learning. So it was really interesting listening to Catherine, because obviously some of what I'm going to say now echoes what she has said. There was a piece of research that was done by Save the Children, which echoes some of the issues she mentioned about it's not enough just to have technology, it's not enough to have hardware, it's not enough to have a laptop or even a mobile phone sometimes. The connectivity is an issue, the hardware supply is an issue, the maintenance is an issue, the electricity supply, all of those kind of things. So it's quite difficult sometimes to make technology work in these kind of environments. It's a lot easier in, I don't know, obviously in resource-rich areas, but even in London, I have a better connection sometimes, or I have had a better connection in South Sudan than I had in my house in London. So, you know, that could also be quite interesting. In terms of the second kind of component that I'd like to feature is educational planning. So, does anyone know what educational planning means? Yeah.
So, for educational planning, it's like not just how you're going to plan your school year, it's how your teachers are going to be allocated, it's how you register and recognize your teachers in a certain location, and I don't know, you go from there, but yeah.
Yeah, that's one component of it. So educational planning is in a way it all is at that level of planning teachers and at one level. It's also at a national level planning your whole system. So planning your how do you plan your curriculum? How do you plan your teacher education program? Where are your teacher education programs? Where are your resources coming from? What resources do you need? Where are the gaps, etc., etc. So there's a massive kind of big whole industry around educational planning, which some of you may or may not learn at a later stage. But one massive part of educational planning is data collection. And this is particularly true in situations of crisis and emergency, because you've got all of these people who are displaced, or people who are in camps, schools being set up randomly. When I was in Tanzania, you know, people would just set up a school without anybody doing anything. They would have a teacher and they'd have a set of benches that they'd chop down a few trees for, and there would be the school. So how do you track these schools? How do you track the teachers who are teaching them? So all of this kind of aspect is really critical for educational planning. And the use of mobile phones and the use of GPS data and cameras, which have come in more recently, have been really, really important in trying to get over some of the obstacles around data collection in an emergency situation. And it helps also in a very rapid situation, so that you can do this rapid assessment, but it also helps you over the long term and in long-term educational planning, because educational planning is not just for, you know, the 6 months while the refugees are here. We all know that refugees often stay in camps or in wherever they're staying, if they're not in camps, in cities, for up to 17 years. So 20 years sometimes. So it's not it's not short term. You're looking at long-term planning. And these kind of rapid assessments can using mobile phones, can be really, really useful in trying to sort of collect some of this necessary data. And you can train people to use these phones. And I'll give you an example of this now. In South Sudan, where I worked quite a lot, there was an organisation called FHI 360, which is an American-based organisation, which started back in 2010, I think, equipping teachers and local district officials with mobile phones to provide data on the schools in their areas. And so they produced this map that you can see here. It's a traditional school mapping, so it's basically mapping where the schools were, what the infrastructure was like, how many teachers there were, etc. So that's the kind of data that you would collect in a typical school mapping exercise. So basically, children, teachers, infrastructure, etc., etc. In Ethiopia, more recently, basically in the last year, UNESCO IIP have been working with district-based officials to collect information, again using tablets and mobile phones, but on the type of emergencies and the type of risks that people are facing. So slightly different type of mapping. So not just where the schools are located, but also what they've got to deal with in terms of the type of emergency and contingencies that they need to cope with. And this also is quite unique. It's a unique program. I haven't seen any other program like it that brings together sort of joint planning between the host community and the refugee communities together. That's quite unusual. That doesn't happen very often. It's quite often difficult to bring the two communities together. So this is a very interesting collaborative example in how technology can bring people together to collaborate. So this was my higher education piece, and I don't really know very much about this, so I just kind of brought it out because I thought I should say something about higher education, but I needn't have worried because you had it all covered. But I thought these were actually quite, I don't know if you came across these in your, did you come across these in your research?
When I said Jesuit World Learning,
yeah,
they've just changed their name. Like,
oh,
really
okay.
Jesuit Commons.
Okay, right. Okay.
Yeah,
okay, so so, and I thought it was great, you know, the whole thing of WhatsApp. I don't know about you guys, but I'm always on WhatsApp. I think my whole life is taken over by WhatsApp these days, and but I think it's a fantastic resource how people can learn through something as simple as WhatsApp messages. The mobile money transfer thing, I came across that again, I don't know, it was in Somalia actually, Somaliland. I think they were first using it there. I think it was first used in Somaliland. And they were transferring money through mobile phone. And was it Barclays? I think it's Barclays ended up taking over the system. And it's revolutionised. We've all seen it now, how you can pay with a mobile phone and you can transfer money between people. But people were getting their remittances from it to their homes, basically in Somaliland, through their mobile phone. And I thought this is just fantastic because this has allowed so many more opportunities for people to be supported by the diaspora. You know, when they're a refugee in a different context. So I was really, I thought that should be mentioned. I'm going to try and play. This is the last bit of implementation because this is something when we talked about collaboration and communication before and coordination, and Catherine brought it up, the difficulty of coordinating. You can imagine where an emergency strikes, there's thousands of people are flying in, thousands of people all over the place. Who knows where they are? Who knows what they're doing? Lots of duplication, etc., etc. One effort to try and overcome this was this: the OCHA, the Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, humanitarian ID contact list, and they've tried to sort of through a simple app produce this ID. So I'm just going to play a very short video which will tell you a little bit about. It's just so we can have a little break actually. you can have a little rest.
When a humanitarian crisis or disaster happens, people from the local area, affected country, and around the world try to help those in need. Being connected to each other and having access to the right information means they can do their job better. But in the chaos a crisis creates, finding out who is working where and doing what, and being able to contact them, is incredibly difficult. Humanitarian ID is a single contact management app for everyone working in humanitarian crises and disasters. It makes it easier and faster for humanitarian professionals from across the globe to connect, communicate, and collaborate, even in the height of a new emergency. Here's how it works. Users register on Humanitarian ID and create their own profile with their contact and professional information. This creates a global directory of humanitarian professionals. When they start work in a new emergency, they can check in to be added to the contact list and receive relevant information. Once checked in, they can search for the contact details of other people working there. Where security risk is high, only verified users can access each other's contact information. They can then connect, collaborate, and stay on top of the latest information they need. Checking out of the emergency keeps the directory up to date for others and ensures that users no longer receive irrelevant information. Humanitarian ID is useful for everyone involved. Humanitarian workers can easily find and contact each other, even if they've just arrived to a new emergency. Coordinators can find people working in their sector. They can manage their list of contacts and easily communicate with everyone. And managers can see an overview of their staff contact details and better understand capacity and gaps. So, if you are working in a humanitarian crisis or disaster, make sure you register on Humanitarian ID. You'll be able to find and connect with other professionals and obtain the right information to do your job. To register, please visit humanitarian.id.
So, for me, that actually was quite a wrong one. That was quite an interesting. There we go. Right. It was an interesting opportunity to see how implementation could be improved and how you can get that overview of people working in such a chaotic situation. So I was quite intrigued to find that as one of the newer, because most of my stuff is a bit dated, but that actually has come out and is being used now. So it's if any of you are going into humanitarian situations in the future, you'll be able to join up. As Catherine said, we have to go forward with the use of technology with caution. How many of you know what that computer on the right-hand side is? Does anyone know? Chris?
Well, it looks like the one laptop per child,
Absolutely.
$100.
Do you know what happened to the one laptop per child program?
Well, I know how it started from the MIT lab and Nicholas Negroponte, his pet project, but I don't know how it finished.
Well, sad to say, like a lot of good intentions, it wasn't a $100 laptop. There were problems with connectivity. There were problems with laptop. Have you? And what was your experience of it?
No, I didn't use it, but I used it as a case study, something that I did.
Okay.
I know what happened with one project.
Do you want to say? You probably know better than I.
There were lots of assumptions made by the people that developed it. It was meant be provided one laptop for every child worldwide. It was meant to be durable enough that you could use it in any environment. You could use it in the snow, you could use it on mountains, and it was going to cost, had a price point of under $100. So there were lots of assumptions that were made. For one, it didn't work when they started producing them. Secondly, there was an assumption that governments would pay for them, and governments didn't. They had other priorities like health and everything else. And they couldn't produce them at the cost that they initially quoted. So that was the biggest killer of all. No, I think the biggest killer actually was that all the big players, they didn't collaborate when they came up with the ideas. They didn't talk to Dell or any of the big players. And so all the big players went into the market, saw that there was a market for low-cost laptops, and went into the market and undercut them.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So it failed. Basically, I think it didn't even last I think it wasn't even 5 years. So there are a lot of issues around introducing new technologies into these kind of environments. And we also heard about the whole thing of do no harm from Catherine. You know, there's a big problem here, and we know about sort of the issue around data ownership and data hacking, all of the global stuff that's going on now. How do you protect sort of vulnerable refugees, migrant populations, displaced persons? How do you protect them from all of those dangers when you're trying to do good, but sometimes you may end up doing more harm. The cost, we've heard, initially may seem as though it's quite low cost. Oh, we're going to have solar power. I remember a friend of mine set up a solar-powered internet cafe in a refugee camp in Tanzania, and it was fine while he was there because he knew how to maintain it. As when he went, sometimes that you have to build in the maintenance training of people, the cost of continuing to replace parts, etc., the power, all of these kind of things. Also, sort of one issue that I've certainly came across when trying to do the work I did in South Sudan was procuring things locally. Sometimes you would want to procure things locally and you think that that's the way to go, but it was impossible, and the cost was so high to procure locally that you couldn't. So you would then have all of these computers coming into the port where they'd be stuck or they'd be stolen or something would happen. So there are all these trade-offs between trying to do things in the right way versus sort of the realities on the ground, and you have to sort of build in those realities to anything that you're going to do. I've said about the infrastructure, it's the same thing. It's sort of trying to use that sort of efficient type of technology. If you can use radio, why not just use radio? Why bring in a load of computers if actually radio is going to do the job and it will do it more effectively? Also, Catherine touched on this, the issue of equity and who's going to use this technology, who's going to be able to access it, where are the power relations what are the power relations involved in around the use of technology, and that is a very big issue where you've got valuable equipment and valuable knowledge as well, because knowledge, as we know, is power. So I have put up here. Again, I think if you're able to share the PowerPoints, you can have these resources. Who's heard of the Interagency Network for Education in Emergency? I know you have. So not very many of you. This is a superb network, and it's free to join, so please join. It has so many resources connected to, not just to education emergencies, but resources that are relevant for education more generally. And they have started a technology and education in crisis task team, which is very dynamic. There are fantastic webinar series on there. So I would advise anybody who's interested in this topic to go to that website. And these are various types of resources. This, trying to think which, oh no, there was a paper that I worked on with IIP, but I didn't put it up there, but never mind. It's a bit outdated anyway, so it's, oh maybe it's that one, the Global Education Cluster one, yeah, with IIP. And that did a little bit of a review of some of the things I've been talking about as well. So again, have a look at Granny in the Cloud, fantastic. And listen, if you've never listened to him, listen to Sugata Mitra on the TED Talks. Okay. Before we go to Q&A, I thought it might be quite interesting just to have 5 minutes on your tables. For you, anybody who needs to go should go now, but if have 5 minutes on your tables just to come up with one thing that you think technology could be best used for, just one thing, and then on your table just drill that down to one word, so that when I go round the tables, you shout out just the one word that technology could be best used for. Okay, ready? 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Well, it's very random. It's all kind of cobbled together from different bits and pieces. So.
Have you seen Tim Unwin's new book, Reclaiming ICT for Development?
No.
It's one of the best ones I've seen,
Okay.
And he's really thoughtful.
Oh, we're going to stop just for a few minutes while people just talk. Is that okay?
So you can hear us on everything.
Oh, you can hear everything. Okay.
Sorry, excuse me.
Yeah.
I want to confirm the question. Is that what the technology or how the technology be used better?
Whatever you like, you choose. Was feeding through to the
Okay, everybody. Hopefully you've had it's a good sign when people don't want to stop talking. I love that. But as a teacher, I have to say, you have to stop talking now. So I'm just going to go around very quickly, each table, and just, if you can narrow it to one word, that would be great. So.
Omnipresent avatars.
Okay, omnipresent avatars, interesting.
Saying digital EMIS or EMIS systems, like cloud-based EMIS.
Cloud-based EMIS, oh, I love that. Yeah, I love that idea. I'm going to send that to IIP.
We'll talk about the Moodles. Use as a Moodle, like when we use it for the university.
Okay, so Moodle.
Yeah.
Yeah, wow. Yeah.
I love that.
Okay.
Tracking.
Tracking. Okay. Sorry, I've got to turn off this. It's my alarm system to give my dog some medicine. So hence the barking. So sorry. That's my main use of technology. Okay, so tracking refugees, tracking anybody in a way, couldn't it? Yeah. Fantastic. Yeah. Okay. At the back.
Monitoring.
Monitoring. Okay. Cool. Yeah. Absolutely. This table.
So, also in case of an emergency, we also thought about connecting people.
So connections and collaboration. So fantastic.
Yeah, we thought it's kind of bridge. So we can imply many things like action.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. Wow. I hope it's a shame I didn't have a blackboard or something to write. Oh, I did actually, but it would have been quite good to have written those down. I only thought of doing that just off the cuff, just because sometimes it's quite nice to have a bit of a chat with each other as well. Okay, so I think we could open it up to general questions for both Catherine and I, don't you think, maybe? Any more
questions or comments?
Discussion or ideas? It'd be nice to hear some more ideas from some of you, from your discussions as well, do you think? Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What is a question?
Okay.
I was looking at your school mapping examples.
Okay,
and,
yeah.
Oh, sorry, my name is Umo Young, and I work for Plan International UK. And I was wondering around the example you gave about Ethiopia.
Yeah.
And you had said that they've used technology to do mapping and joint planning for refugee schools and the host communities.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if you could explain how that happened, because I sort of know that in Ethiopia the refugee camps sit under a certain government body and separate and distinct to the host communities.
It is, yeah.
And they manage education totally distinct. So,
So that's a really good point, where you sometimes in refugee situations or displaced situations, you've got different bodies managing the education system. Sometimes the ministries of education of a host country don't have anything to do with the management of education in a refugee camp. So you're right, in this situation, the body called ARA that manages the refugee education system, we managed to get both ARA, it wasn't me because it was my colleague Leonora McEwen who I was involved a little bit at the beginning, and then she's taken it forward to develop this amazing, wonderful project. But we worked with ARA and the Ministry of Education together and brought them together to work together on this specifically on this project. So that's how we managed to get the two to work together. So it was also kind of quite a unique way of bringing different collaborators and different stakeholders together. So around this school mapping, it was actually a very participatory process and involving a lot of training and using the enumerators to sort of work out how to do the school mapping, etc., as well as the high level policy makers. So it was a very good project. Yeah.
Any other specific questions for me, or we can open it up to more broad questions?
My name's Katie, I work for Save the Children. Just a question on funding. So a lot of donors are really interested in these innovative projects for kind of sexy PR for their kind of see a scale up and actually do these projects en masse and not just the one-off token gestures. Have you got any advice?
I think it is showing that you can go to scale, and it is something that would be sustainable within a national government system. So I think if you can demonstrate a project that would have those elements as well as as well as being sexy, then I think you can. That's what donors want to see. They want to be able to see the scalability and the impact and the long-term sustainability within national systems. Like that's, I don't know. I mean, you might want to add to that.
Yeah, the best paper I know on going to scale is by Francis Kemmerer in Chapman and Carrier, and I think it's called Improving Educational Quality. And the paper, the chapter's called Going to Scale, Why Projects Fail. The problem is the factors that determine success at national scale are not the factors that determine success at the pilot scale. So when they pilot interventions, it doesn't tell you most of what you need to know at the national scale. And one model is to roll out incrementally in a phased way. So you might start with one district and then go to 10 and then go to 50 and then cover the country. All the time monitoring and evaluating and feeding back into the design of the model. There isn't an easy way to do it. It's trial and error and adapting what you learn, because every context, as Catherine said, context matters, context drives. Context is all informing, and every context is different in space and time and culture.
Yeah.
Any other comments or questions to our presenters?
This is more of a practical question, Catherine. You said you were connecting students in different countries. What platform were you using for that?
So this was the Jesuit World Learning, so they were using their Blackboard software in different places, yeah.
Okay, perhaps I can make a couple of comments. Arthur C. Clarke is reputed to have said, "The teacher who can be replaced by a machine should be." You know, many people will have read Brave New World, and the way Big Brother is in your room and surveying you and controlling you, and so there is a big school of thought that is afraid of technology, a pessimistic view of technology. But if you think about what's happening, I have Alexa by my bed to wake me up. So it's not Big Brother, it's Big Sister. And it's not the state, it's the market. And it's not imposed, it's willingly embraced. But it's an embryonic form of AI, artificial intelligence, and it apparently learns when it can't answer your question, it will learn how to answer next time. So I don't think we're that far away where we will have blended learning with great AI systems supporting very, very good teachers. And this will change pedagogies. And that's a wonderful future, I think, to think that we won't have to memorize much. We'll have to think, how do we learn? How do we problem solve? I've been reading about critical theory and a theory of the causal structure, the causal power of social structure, and the theory of emergence. If you think of water composed of hydrogen and oxygen, water has the emergent property to put out fire. But if you try to do that with its component parts, hydrogen and oxygen, you get completely different result. So by bringing those two elements together, you get a new emergent capability. And it's interesting when people talk about technology's capability. Commercial jet travel was the result of 5 innovations being brought together around the same time, or over the 2 decades that it took to develop commercial jet aircraft, the Comet. The jet engine, the wings, the pressurization. It was the bringing together of contemporary innovation in a unique way that gave us affordable global travel, commercial travel. Education technology is going to be a bit like that. We've got the internet, we've got the computer, we've got the smartphone. It's the configuration, how you bring it together. But as good educators, what's the problem? Who are the audience? Take note of the context. Technology doesn't determine. There's a lot of stuff. I was reading Rebecca Winthrop's latest paper from the Brookings, saying about leapfrogging. Technology will help us leapfrog. I don't think it will. The history of technological intervention, insertion into education systems has not been a happy one, has not been a successful one, because technology doesn't drive it. And I think the last point that really inspired me was Catherine's starting point. What's the need? John Rawls wrote a book, Justice as Fairness, and one of his organising principles as fair, the fair society, is the difference principle. It's okay to have big differences between wealthy people and not so wealthy people, provided the wealthy act in the interests of the least advantaged. Now, we are the wealthy. Catherine, me, most of you, although you may not feel it being students on grants or self-funding without jobs, but we belong to the wealthy class. And it's our duty or our role to spot the least advantaged opportunity and go out and try and change that role, change that world. And so really that's part of, I think, Catherine's case history and the Refugee Support Network and Jigsaw Consult, and you see how that emerges. One thing leads to another, but it's a commitment, a deep commitment to social justice. So you're not here just to get an MA. Never, never, never. You're here for deeper ontological reasons than that. And most of you will commit for life. But don't let anybody tell you, you know, technology is going to solve the world's problems. Certainly won't be in my lifetime. So any comments or questions from your reflections on what you've heard this evening? Okay.
I suppose I just wanted to go back. Sorry, it's really interesting what you were talking about in terms of the higher education and blended programs. When you were talking about the facilitators, what kind of training did the facilitators receive in order to be facilitators, I suppose, really?
Do you mean the distance?
Yeah,
ones, okay.
yeah. So you thought there were sometimes some issues around that.
Yeah. In most cases, very little, and I think that's one of the things that some of the programs are looking at, introducing really concrete ways of improving that at the moment. But typically, what would happen is that whatever university was running a particular course would be asking staff in that university, so the existing lecturers that tend to teach that course or similar courses, to come and essentially volunteer their time to also teach it on this online version. And they would, in the best case scenarios, be given a kind of briefing about the context that the students were in, briefing about the countries of origin, briefing about the host countries and the camp context. But just literally, please read this. And it was their qualifications as lecturers that were considered to be enough to do that. And I think what the students were saying is, and actually they had some really interesting ideas about how technology could be used to facilitate this. They were saying, they need to have some kind of, for example, they can't all get on an airplane and come here before they start teaching us, but like a visual tour of what this camp is like, what the urban environment that we're living in, listen to young people who are students talking about the challenges that they face in completing the course from the year before, all of these types of things to emphasize the human aspect of studying, rather than us kind of speaking of it into a vacuum online, and then the local facilitators then having quite a huge job to do, to be able to contextualize that and actually support the students with learning. But I think some real remarkable progress that has been made, and I think what people are doing right now is definitely a big step on from what it was when we were talking to the students a couple of years ago.
Okay. Any more comments or questions? Yes?
I'm Ben from Plan International. More for you, Lindsay, I think. We've talked quite a bit about the use of technology with things such as planning, data collection. We've kind of touched on the role it can play with kind of learning. But then we've kind of there's been more mention of things like hole in the wall by Sagat and Mitchell and things. That makes the assumption that almost a teacher can be replaced by technology. I wonder if you had any more comments on your experience of how actually technology can be utilised and integrated into the classroom, on the assumption that actually the teacher is vitally important, which is more my opinion, that they can't be replaced. And maybe I'm saying that as a teacher myself as well, but I still want to be. But kind of what are your experiences of how technology has been integrated into the classroom well, particularly as well in lower income countries, and rather than we've had a few kind of examples in the Middle East where it's maybe a bit easier.
I think you're very right. I didn't go into much detail about the teaching and learning mainly because there's so much more information about that kind of available. So I was kind of touching a little bit more on things that well, A, that I knew more about, and B, that other people might know a little bit less about. But there's a lot around the whole issue of using technology for teaching and learning. And in my experience, sort of sometimes that trying to replace technologies for teachers, that it doesn't always work. No, it doesn't. The Sugata Mitra model is one approach which I think has a role to play. I don't think he's trying to say get rid of teachers, but he's trying to say have teachers more as facilitators rather than not dictators, but that's the wrong term, but trying to help encourage children to learn together. So his model is that you would have 4 children around a laptop is the optimum number to learn most effectively for children. And he's done studies with children in Newcastle, deprived background in Newcastle, compared to children in India. So he's done studies around that. My only personal experience was in Tanzania, where it wasn't only with the refugees that I saw technology being used, it was also the same friend that set up the internet in the camp, also set it up in the teacher training college in a small district in Tanzania. And that has now been rolled out throughout the country. And so all teacher training colleges now have access to internet and access to resources. And I think that's where the teaching bit comes in, because it's less about sort of the technology for use in a classroom, because, to be frank, if you're teaching in a tent or under a tree, that technology is not going to be able to be much used there. but it's the ability of teachers to access knowledge and access information and resources through technology, through resource centres. I used to be really hot on trying to establish resource centres for teachers I mean, it was a big thing, you'll remember a long time, well, back in the day again, it was, you know, those were the things. And technology was brought in, I think, a bit too early in those days because, you know, they would put computers in, but there was nobody to use them, there was nobody to maintain them, there was nobody to teach people how to access the knowledge. So they fell by the wayside. So I think it's a really important point. And I think for learning too, I think we are going to be overtaken by technology in terms of learning, because people are learning in these kind of contexts. In your context here, you're all learning through your phones, through your tablets, through your computers. That's going to spread. Mobile phone is more ubiquitous in so many contexts now that I think learning will start to take place through mobile phone much more quickly than we probably think. It won't replace the teacher, but it will facilitate, you know, your own self development, I think. So I don't know if that really answers your question.
Okay. I have some comments about the technology, whether will it replace the teachers. Actually, from my experience, I found this kind of worries is not exist in everywhere, especially the low resources place, because at that places the teachers the first is inadequate. So I think maybe due to the lower salaries, or even in some urban places, teachers are always complain about the low supplies, and some people may not would like to choose another vocation. And then the secondly is quality of the teachers. In some places, the teachers are not qualified. They are not formal teacher actually. It's just that some people know a little bit more information than other people, so they can be teachers. So I think the technology is a very good thing for this place. It help to tackle the lack of the teachers, and it has some standard quality for the students. So maybe in the future, not so much teacher, but very qualified and very good at using the technology to help and to support students to learn something. And I think in the future, maybe everyone can be everyone's teachers, not just the teacher from teacher training college. So. And I think self-learning ability is more and more important in the future. So from my perspective, I don't think the technology is a threat for teachers.
I think it's a really, really good point, because I think there are increasingly sort of sharing. There's a whole sharing community in that whole open source type of approach where you're sharing lesson plans. So teachers are sharing lesson plans around the globe basically, and so you can download lesson plans onto your phone, and you know that strengthens teachers' ability to teach, and it also can mean that children can do the same and question their teachers if they're not getting the right kind of teaching. But I think that's a really important
and I have
point.
A last point I forgot to say is that in some places the good teacher or the better teacher, they might be in the very good schools, and the schools they are not so good, or they are not model school. They don't have the better teacher resources. So that might be lead to social inequality or social something like social diversion. I think that in the future the technology is the only way to break the social diversion.
Interesting.
Okay, last point, and then we'll wrap it up.
I'm also a teacher, so it's interesting to me. But I think, kind of going back to previous points, and what you said as well, that I think that if we are talking about technology, you know, supporting teachers, then I think it's looking at how to incorporate that more globally within initial teacher training programs as well. Because I don't think that happens in very many places, even in the UK, actually. So I think that is one thing to think about.
Yeah. If you're interested, the best book I've read recently on this is by Tim Unwin, Reclaiming ICTs for Development, 2017, published by Oxford University Press. Tim was the one-time director of Tony Blair's special initiative for Africa called Infundo, and the Ndebele word meaning knowledge, I believe. And Tony Blair was taught to send emails by somebody called Owen Barder, one of his officers. And when he could first sent an email, he thought it was so wonderful, he must set up a project to help the poor Africans. In my experience, the poor Africans taught me more about how to use my mobile phone than anybody. So we can get it very wrong, and the very wrong the wrong way round. So all that it left for me is to thank our speakers for giving up their evening, and thank them very much for speaking, and thanks for coming. And to you.